Well, good evening, colleagues, and those who are members of the Corpus field workers, and anyone who's joining us from outside for the annual lecture of the Corpus of Romanesque Sculpture in Britain and Ireland. I'm the chairman, chairman of the Board of Trustees. The Corpus has a two-headed direction. We are a charity, and therefore we have a Board of Trustees, and we have a management board who are responsible for the functioning and progress of the Corpus. And the chairman of that management board is our speaker tonight, Xavier Dectot, who has been the chairman of the management board since 2018. And it is tonight that we're getting what should have been last year's lecture. Xavier was trapped in the Middle East before the days of Zoom and was unable to give the lecture. And so we are very, very pleased that he's agreed to do it tonight. The career of Xavier is rich and varied, and he is at present director of the Orientalist Museum of the Qatar museums in Doha, which are due to open in 2026. And believe it or not, he's talking to us tonight from Doha, which is difficult for me to get my head around. His career, as I say, has been very rich and varied. He's been previously at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. And before that, he was director of the Louvre at Lens in northern France. And that succeeded a short spell at the Musée de Cluny in Paris, where he was responsible for a number of initiatives, including one or two very, very remarkable exhibitions. For those of us who are lovers of Romanesque sculpture, we'll all remember the little small exhibition that he did there, which brought to Paris all the wonderful wooden sculptures from the Val de Bois in the Pyrenees in Catalonia. He's a Chartiste, that is to say his first higher education was at the École Nationale des Chartes in Paris. He was of the promotion of 1998. At the École des Chartes, he wrote his thesis on the tombs of the Counts of Champagne, which was later in 2004 published in the Bulletin Monumental. I mention this in particular because of his subject tonight, and also another publication, which was on the royal tombs of the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages, which was a book published by Brepols in 2009. Thank you so much, Xavier, in advance for talking to us tonight. His theme is Paradise Found, Tombs in Western Europe, circa 1000 to circa 1150. Xavier.
Many thanks, Professor Stratford, for this introduction, and many thanks for giving me the honor of talking to you tonight, and thanks for coming in such high numbers. I can see already 246 people. That's even scarier than talking to 246 people in a live audience. So also, this is the I hope you'll all be able to understand me. As you may notice, I have a slightly thick French accent, despite a few years now living abroad. But I hope you, yes, I'll try to speak slowly so that everything is clear. So my presentation tonight, as Professor Stratford said, will be called Paradise Found, and it will be about Romanesque tombs in Western Europe. Mostly, I have to admit, and you'll notice that I have a strong tropism toward Spain and a little bit towards France too. But it also happens that, at least in my opinion, that's the Iberian Peninsula is one of the places where the practice of tomb sculpture is the most active in the 11th and early 12th century. Anyhow, up to, well, 20 years ago, nearly 25 years ago, when I started working on tomb sculpture, I had the impression that I was in a sort of a lonely field. There were some great elders, people like Panofsky, of course, and then Ireland, Brandenburg, and others who'd written quite a few seminal books in the 1960s, 1970s. But the field had then been left very much aside by art historians. Although little did I know at that time that I was far from alone in this renewed interest for tomb sculptures. And in the 2000s, early 2010s, there were quite a lot of publications on the subject, but most of them focused, and that was the case, including of my thesis from the École des Chartes, focused on the most visible and also more prolific field of Gothic tomb sculpture, both the reclining figures and the tomb slabs. Up to very recently, I could have said that in comparison, the Romanesque tombs, the subject of Romanesque tombs was left nearly unexplored. But I have to note that there was a very good book that was published 3 months ago on Romanesque tomb effigies. So one aspect of tomb structure by Shirin Fozzi, and which has slightly renewed and brought a new dynamism to the field, which is something that that is very satisfying. Usually, in the Panofskian vision of the history of tomb sculpture, which still very much dominates the field, there is a very teleological vision where things start with Etruscan tombs actually, and then Roman tombs, and then go from the Roman tombs to the Romanesque tombs and the Gothic tombs, like an uninterrupted flow. And with this idea that the reclining figure, the gisant, would be kind of the apex toward the goal towards which all the rest of the tomb structure will have been heading. Actually, it's slightly more complicated than that, obviously. And the first fact one has to note is that the practice of visible tombs nearly disappeared in Western Europe from the late 4th, early 5th century, the real end of the Roman era, to nearly the 10th century. For all that period, there are still sarcophagi and a lot of ornate sarcophagi, but most of them are destined to be fully buried and not to be visible, seen by anyone after the burial ceremony. There are very few exceptions, like here I'm showing you the bottom panel from the sarcophagus of Saint Agilbert in the crypt of the church in Jouarre in Seine-et-Marne, which dates to the 7th, maybe early 8th century, and which is obviously a tomb, and it's actually a series of tombs with 3 sarcophagi, which were made to be seen, but we don't really understand what the context was. And they really appear as unica in the world of this late Merovingian or early Carolingian era. Of course, in the north, in Scandinavia, you have the practice of erecting runestones, of which can be, for some of them, commemorative, and which at some point conflate with the idea of the Christian tomb, at least with this quite famous monument, which was erected by the King of Denmark and Norway, Harald Bluetooth. Yes, he's the one who gave his name to the current technology. In the second half of the 10th century, it's a very interesting monument, slightly, once again, it's slightly different because, well, the parents of Harald Bluetooth were pagan, and they were buried under tumuli, and Harald, in opposition, Harald himself converted to Christianism, and it seems that he wanted to create a monument for not only the memory, but also the salvation of his parents by erecting a church and this runestone, on one side of which you have this very intriguing figuration of a crucified Christ in the middle of interlaced elements. Anyhow, those are very rare elements, and once again, most of the tombs from that period were made to be not to be seen. Things start to change in oh yes, sorry, and another example of that is the only thing that could be seen or that was shown was the epitaph, so a written text. Here you have a very famous one, the epitaph of Pope Adrian, who died in 795. It's very famous because the epitaph was commissioned by Charlemagne, and so it's both a piece of commemoration, but of course it's got a very strong political aftermath. Anyhow, for all this second half of the first millennium, really the emphasis is on the written word, with a separation between those epitaphs and tombs which are not made to be visible and with no real visual commemoration of the body. Things start to change in the 11th century. And here we have one of the very first examples of those tombs, which is the tomb of one of the abbots of the Abbey of Saint Victor in Marseille, so in southern France. It dates to the middle of the 11th century. And first thing to note is that, although, as I said, there is a huge gap between the era of the Roman sarcophagi and this resurgence of the Romanesque tomb in the 11th century, that doesn't mean that Roman sarcophagi were completely unknown. First of all, some of them might have been visible. And second, well, the tomb of Saint-Isarn shows quite evidently that there was an access to Roman sarcophagi, because it's actually the reuse of marble, which probably comes from an older Roman sarcophagi. Anyhow, it's a quite interesting figure because, as you can see, it's kind of sits halfway between the idea of the epitaph and the idea of some kind of figurative tomb with this big, great rectangular element in the middle, and only the head and the feet of the abbot, which appear on both sides, with the abbot holding his toe, so the sign of his power. One of the most interesting things, at least in my opinion, one of the things that the most surprising is that, once again, in this very teleological vision of tomb sculpture that we have, we tend to look at Romanesque tomb sculpture through the lens of Gothic tombs. And obviously, many Gothic tombs are made to ask for prayers for the dead represented, and to be, and even if they don't directly ask for prayers, they're often placed in such a way that they are linked to an altar, and they would be shown or would be part of special ceremonies for in memory of the dead, and made to ensure that the dead would leave purgatory and access paradise. It's actually obvious, but we tend to forget that as has been shown by Jacques Le Goff and nuanced and developed by others, the idea of purgatory, although it has its roots in late 11th, early 12th century Cluniac theology, it only actually really develops in the late 12th, early 13th century, and really spreads through mainstream theology in the early to mid 13th century. Actually, in the mid 11th century, the vision of death and life after death relied not on the idea of purgatory, but on a book, a biblical book, which is not canonical anymore, but was considered canonical at the time, and which was the fourth book of Esdras, so which is part of the Old Testament, or more appropriately of the intertestamentary books. Well, you might think that you don't know about the fourth book of Esdras, but to give you an idea of its influence, the main theme is that Esdras is who is a prophet, has an angel appear to him, and the angel gets him through the ninth circle of hell and through the seventh skies of heaven. Any resemblance with Dante's Divina Commedia is absolutely not a coincidence. And another element you may have, which actually has come up to us, is the fact that at one moment the angel tells Esdras about the dead souls. May God give them eternal rest, and may a perpetual light shine on them. Requiem aeternam Deis Domine, et lux perpetua luceatis, which is obviously up to now the beginning of the Mass for the dead. Anyhow, in Esdras, you'll have noticed that there is no purgatory, obviously, and actually there is no there is a large uncertainty between the question of immediate salvation, salvation right after death, or salvation at the time or at the end of times. And this is something we find again in, for example, this tomb of Abbot Isarn, which at some point here, sorry, Quae felit vegetans anima provetsit ad alta. So it says about him that a blessed and very animated soul brought him to heaven. So there is no doubt in the epitaph, even if around his head are verses which do relate to the fact that death is a bad thing and something that's not very, one should be sad about, but this part doesn't leave any doubt about the fact that actually Isarn has already met with his salvation. And very similar is another of those very famous tombs from the 11th century, the tomb from Rudolf of Swabia, who is buried in the Cathedral of Merseburg and shortly after 1080. Rudolf of Swabia obviously is a very weird person, and it's quite surprising that he would be one of the first people to have a tomb, because unlike what his gear might suggest, he was not an emperor. He was actually an anti-emperor during the imperial civil war around the question of the war between the emperor and the supporters of the papacy in the late 11th century German Empire. Rudolf of Swabia actually took the head of a faction of nobles who were supporting the papacy against the emperor. And actually, the poor Rudolf of Swabia died. He was victorious, and he had a very his faction was triumphing against the forces of the emperor. Sadly, in 1080, he won a battle, but he died from his wounds shortly after the battle and was buried with all honors in the Cathedral of Merseburg. Something which obviously was still was a way of for the church of taunting the emperor, and there are up to the mid-12th century mentions of the tensions this tomb creates between the imperial power and the church. A couple of things to note. First of all, it's a tomb which is made of bronze. And bronze tombs are pretty rare now, but of course they are far easier to destroy, and they tend to disappear much more than stone tombs or tombs in, yes, mostly stone tombs. Nonetheless, it was a very expensive material, so it's definitely a very high level commission, which shows also in the quality of the sculpture. The one thing I would like to emphasize here is the way the epitaph, once again, is made to be read. As you can see, I think the letters change direction as they go around the frame, which means that actually the epitaph is made to be read by someone who would go around the frame in a circular manner. And we'll see that quite a few other tombs are made and conceived to have this kind of circular circulation around them. And that's actually not at all a coincidence. And I think that's also one hint at to where this idea of the renewal of the tomb comes from. Not as has often been thought from reliquaries, but from another type of element that is related to the cult of saints, which is, well, saint tombs. And of course, the most famous of those saints' tombs in the Middle Ages is, and later, is the tomb of Saint Peter in Rome. And here you have a plan of the former, so the ancient basilica of Saint Peter in Rome, and so the plan here is from 1590, so it's a very late representation, and not everything would correspond to what was in place in the 11th century. But the one thing that is there for sure is all this dispositive in the apse around the tomb of Saint Peter, which was often referred to as the confession of Saint Peter. And the practice for this tomb and for many other tombs of saints was that pilgrims would come and circulate around the tomb. So they would go in a circle around the tomb. And although the tombs, some major tombs like that of Saint Peter or the tomb of Saint James in Santiago de Compostela have not come to us in their medieval state, and they've been changed in the 16th, 17th century. I give you here an example, which is obviously much later than the period we're interested in, but of a tomb. So it's not the only example I could have chosen. I'll have to admit that one of the reasons I choose it is that Eulalia is the middle name of my daughter, who might be listening. But anyhow, this is another major local pilgrimage site, which is the Crypt of Saint Eulalia in the Cathedral of Barcelona in Catalonia, which was remodeled in the early 16th century, but which did keep a much older structure. And you can see that the tomb is actually in the middle with an altar in front, so that masses can be celebrated. But we know that masses for titular saints were not were celebrated actually on the altar on very specific festive days, and that the celebration of masses was a very big honor, which would only be given to bishops or cardinals. But anyhow, it's also made as a pilgrimage place, so that people can go around the tomb and see it. And from early medieval practices, and later we know that people wouldn't directly touch the tomb, but they would often take a piece of cloth or a little bit of oil, which they would have touched the tomb and use as after that as a contact relic. And there was a huge trade in those pilgrimage sites for those contact relics. But anyhow, there is this idea that the tomb of the saint is something that you do you circulate around. And I think that those early, I posit that those early 11th, early 12th century tombs are made actually with this model of the saint's tomb in mind. And that's why we have those shapes that we saw both for Isarn and for Rudolf of Swabia, which are made once again with this circulation around in mind. Another example of those tombs of that put an emphasis on salvation is the lid of the sarcophagus of Alfonso Ansúrez, who was, sorry for the diacrity, something happened here, that's terrible. But so the lid of the sarcophagus of Alfonso Ansúrez, who was the son of a major noble of the court of Leon, Pedro Ansúrez, and who was buried in the monastery of Sahagún. This lid, after being for a time in the Ford Museum of Art, was it the Ford or the Met? Anyhow, after being for a while in the United States, is now in the Museo Arqueológico Nacional in Madrid. So it dates to the very end of the 12th century. Once again, if you look at the text, you can see that it's actually made with this idea of something that's very visible, although here it's made to be seen from one side. All the text is can be read well, from our current perspective. But the other interesting point, well, there are two things I would like to emphasize about this tomb. The first one is that unlike the tombs of Izarn and Rudolf, this is not the tomb of a major political or ecclesial figure. It's the tomb of a child who died in childhood. And which is something that's not that common later, at least until the 14th century, but we'll see it's not uncommon in this late 11th, early 12th century. The other point is that, once again, the emphasis is not put on the idea of praying for the salvation, but actually on the fact that Alfonso Ansoaz is actually already saved. Because where is he represented? On the top side for you of the lead, you have 4 angels. Another angel here, which is incensing Alfonso, and then the angel Gabriel, a representation of John the Evangelist. And finally, Alfonso Ansoaz next to a hand which is identified as Dextra Domini, so the right hand of God. So once again, what is represented here is Alfonso Ansoaz entering paradise. The question is not salvation. Those tombs are really made to emphasize people who are being shown as examples and people who are already saved, but who then can provide to the living the contact in heaven that will help the living to gain their own salvation. We are much closer here from the tomb of a saint than from to the tomb of a sinner. And another example of that is another tomb of a child, but of course I focus here on tomb sculpture, because this is the purpose of Romanesque sculpture in Britain and Ireland, after all. But here is an example of a tomb which was made in another material. We know there were quite a few of them, but those tend to have completely disappeared as church pavements were remade. It's the tomb of Guillaume of Flanders, so the son of the Count of Flanders, which used to be in the Abbey of Saint-Bertin in Saint-Omer in northern France, and is now in the museum of the Hôtel Sandelin, also in Saint-Omer. Anyhow, what you have here is 2 fragments of this tomb, but it was actually a whole mosaic which covered the whole of the apse of the tomb of the church of Saint-Bertin, which was one of the major abbeys in northern France, and represented our Guillaume amongst quite a few major religious and politic figures. Most especially, you had King David, and here you have King Solomon. So once again, even if it's the tomb of a child, and once you notice here also that the epitaph is once again made to be read by somebody who circles around the tomb, but he was actually most probably represented laying. Of course, here his eyes are closed, so it's his mortal body that's represented, but he's also represented as already being amongst those major religious figures, so in between death and already salvation. I present 2 other examples of those tombs which have a very strong salvation theme. First, 2 Spanish tombs, actually. The first one here is the tomb of the Infanta Doña Sancha in Jaca. And this tomb is, as you can see, actually, it represents the moment of the death itself, with the family of the Infanta already grieving for her, and the bishop, or the abbot actually, who is coming to give her the last rites. But Doña Sancha herself is represented not as a body, but it's actually her soul, which is represented in a mandorla, carried to heaven by two angels. And so once again, you have this this idea that immediately after death, you have salvation, and that actually on both sides, you've got the earthly world, which is being left behind, and Doña Sancha is already carried to heaven. Here is a bad picture of the other side, but just to show you that once again, these tombs do have some links with antique sarcophagi, although those can be sometimes a little further away. But here you can see, so this is the reverse, so the other side of the tomb, and it's not the most prominent side, but you've got something that's very classic in late Roman sarcophagi, which often have scenes like hand scenes or something. Here you have two knights fighting, and what is obviously religious representation of Samson fighting with the lion, but which is treated or presented as part of this hunting, sporting world. And also note the leaves you have here, which are typical of this early 12th century Altora gun sculpture. And last of those great sarcophagi from Spain, the sarcophagi of Doña Blanca, which is the one I used for the cover and the announcement of this this conference, which is a mid-12th century sarcophagi. Once again, like for Guillaume de Flandre and for Alfonso Ansúrez, it's a tomb not so much for someone that for someone that could have been, because Blanca of Navarra was the wife of Sancho Garces of Castilla, but by the time she died, she was just the wife of an infant, and actually she died in childbirth. But she was the wife of an infant, but shortly after her death, her husband became became king of Castilla, and so this tomb has been described in a famous article in the 1990s as a lament for lost queen, and it's very much that. It's somewhere in between the tomb and a prophecy of, or a reminder of what could have been, and actually does give to Blanca a ranch in the Bretagne, because on the right side, on the proper left side, you can see her husband, who is grieving and nearly fainting, and he's already crowned. So obviously this tomb dates from after Sancho III had risen to the throne. But once again, and I've said it more than once, but you notice that once again you have this idea of the salvation, with the soul being carried to the heaven, and on the upper side a representation of the Christ and the apostles. Very quickly, because this is a very bad image, but to say that this idea of the representation of the funeral is going to become something that's very common in the second half of the 12th century. Here you have the tomb of the Count Ramon Berenguer III of Barcelona, so the father of Ramon Berenguer IV, who brought the union of Catalonia, of the county of Barcelona and of the Kingdom of Aragon. But anyhow, so I apologize for this very bad image of sarcophagi, which has been heavily damaged by fire in the 19th century. But this becomes the one thing I wanted to point out is that this sarcophagi is now presenting a whole narrative of the death and burial of Ramon Berenguer III, with the usual scene of the soul being carried to the sky, to heaven, sorry, here on the left, but then the scene of the, the coffin being exposed, and then quite a number of scenes related to the funerals. I'm being far too long, so I go beyond this. I leave aside the tomb of Pierre de Sainte-Fontaine, just to focus on the fact that more and more there is this idea of the commemorative monument becoming something that's necessary to emphasize the importance of certain persons. Here you have one of the two central pillars of the cloister in Moissac. Although, as you know, the cloister in Moissac has been very, very much remodeled in the 13th century and beyond, it seems quite logic to think that the pillars have already been in their, always been in their current positions. Anyhow, the thing I wanted to show you is that you have here, it's not really a tomb, it's a figure of the Abbot Durand, who was both abbot and Bishop of Toulouse, and who is presented exactly in the same way, but in a slightly more prominent manner than the apostles who occupied the angled pillars. Here on your left, you have the apostle representing Saint Paul, so the apostle Paul, and you can see that there is a clear similitude in the posture, in the way they are presented, and actually this representation goes one step beyond. It doesn't just show the abbot as a saint, it actually proclaims that he's reached sainthood, because the inscription you have here says Sanctus Duranus Episcopus Tolosanus et Abbas Moisiaco. So very basic. It says he's Durand, who was both the Bishop of Toulouse and the Abbot of Moissac, but it also says that it's actually Saint Durand. Durand was never canonized, but this, you can see that actually this representation, like many other tombs we've seen, is actually part of an effort to give to deceased a specific standing within a religious the religious world. And this is very similar for the tombs of both the three first abbesses of Quedlinburg in Saxony, which probably were commissioned together in the around 1125. And yeah, the one thing I want, last thing I want to talk about is that this has, these tombs you have seen, although there are not that many of them, but they are relatively frequent nonetheless, and they have created a world in which, in the end, if you want to talk about a further a former person and you want to give him or her, give them a specific status in the world, by the mid 12th century, the tomb had become an essential element of that and part of their status, not some, so it's not an element of salvation. Once again, it's an element of religious status. And here you have something that is not a tomb and that is not Romanesque, but so why is it here, will you say? Well, in the 1140s, the Abbot Suger started to rebuild, as you know, the Abbey of Saint Denis, for which he had quite some issues because the legend had it that it had been consecrated by the Christ himself, and that the only witness of this consecration was a leper who then had been obviously cured and lived to tell the tale. And actually, this legend, which is acknowledged by Suger, and by the late 13th century, one could see in Saint-Denis a tomb that, well, this, which is actually an element from a chancel, but which was shown as being the tomb of the leper, so that leper who would have been the witness of the consecration. And there are quite a few elements which would show that this 8th century or 8th to 10th century marble chancel is probably part of those marble pieces that Suger brought from what he calls the spolia, that he brings from other antique monuments. And so Suger is actually probably the one who had this tomb created as a way to mitigate the transformation he was doing and place them in the whole continuity of this idea of the consecration by the Christ, something he was very wary about doing. Another example of this need for the sarcophagus is this sarcophagus, which is obviously an antique sarcophagus, but which is now shown in in Aachen, in the chapel in Aachen, and which at some point became known as the Sarcophagus of Charlemagne. There is quite a lot of debate about when this actually happened, but whether Charlemagne was actually buried in this sarcophagus or whether it's a later creation, the link between both. The one thing that is sure is that its presentation, its visibility as the sarcophagus of Charlemagne dates back to the invention of the body of Charlemagne by Frederick Barbarossa. So it's part of the recreation or the development of the imperial idea in the German Empire in the mid 12th century. But my point here is that it's very clear that by the mid 12th century, if you wanted to showcase a major figure as a major religious and political power, you needed a tomb, something that was not so much the case before, but a transition that by then had completed. And this also probably explains in a very large part how why in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in this mid-12th century, at the same time as they were redoing the apse of the church, the monks of Saint-Germain commissioned tombs for their founders, so Childebert and Frédégonde. I'll be brief, but I just wanted to emphasize that this tomb shows also another technique that's very little, of which we have very little trace, which is somewhere between the engraved slab and the mosaic with this figure with the of Frédégonde, a technique we have to the best of my knowledge, only another example of, which is, and sorry for this very bad picture, but it's an element that's very damaging itself, the tomb of Adelaide de Savoie, so the queen, also from the mid-12th century. The last thing I wanted to emphasize that by the mid-12th century, as I said, the idea of the tomb is becoming more and more common, and actually starts to spread in England, especially through imports of tombs that come from Tournai in Belgium, where they have this very specific black stone, and where you start to have workshops which specialized in making tombs out of this black stone. And there are three, they start to become very frequent in England in the mid-12th century, and especially you have three major bishops' tombs in Salisbury, in Lincoln, and here the tomb of Bishop Roger in the cathedral in Ely, and which represents actually, once again, is very strong on this idea of salvation, but is already bringing us into another world, which is very much more the world of the late 12th and then later 13th and 14th century. I'll conclude here, thanking you, that's terrible, and thank you very much for your attention. I hope this presentation of the Romanesque tombs of the mid-11th to mid-12th century mostly as a very specific corpus, which has to be and needs to be more and more considered in itself and not in relation to earlier or later tombs, because it really responds to specific elements both in the social and the religious world of the time. And as I said in the beginning, it's very comforting to see that there now are more studies about those tombs, but I think they really are a fascinating moment in, and also something that's not often not looked enough, but is also a fascinating part of the story of Romanesque culture. Thank you very much. And now, if you have some questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Thank you very much. It was a very rich and illuminating lecture. And I've been trying to see, there are questions, I think, here and there.
Right, there's a question from Nigel Clubb, who wants to know if there's anything we can say about the relationship of tomb sculpture and the style of architectural sculpture in buildings, Xavier.
Well, often, yes, I really focus on the tomb sculpture, but as I think, well, for example, in Moissac, it's quite evident, but the issue is that more often than not, as always when you work on the High Middle Ages, when you have the tomb, you don't have the monument it comes from, or when you have the monument, you don't have the tombs that were made for it anymore. But there is, of course, a difference in, often a difference in scale between, especially between tombs and capitals. But you might have noticed on some of the tombs I've shown that there are quite a lot of, there can be quite a lot of decorative elements, things like rinceaux, and that you can often compare with, if not with the same monument, at least with local production. I think I also emphasized in the tomb of Doña Sancha in Jaca, those those leaves you had in between the architectures on the obverse side of the tomb, which once again are very close to elements you can find in capitals or other parts of decorative architecture. And another thing I didn't mention is that, especially in Spain, there are quite a few places in this first late element, early 12th century, which are actually created as a place of burial. I'm thinking of places like, or it's not created as places of burial, at least remodeled as places of burial in places like San Isidoro in Leon or San Juan de la Peña. And obviously, in those cases, there is an even more stronger link between architectural structure and tomb structure, because in a way the architecture is part of the tomb.
I'd add that the Haka sarcophagus is not at all far from being related in style, Nigel, to the tympanum at Haka. So you know it's a local context of sculpture. There's a question here I see from Claire Vernon. The relationship between saints' tombs and these tombs is very interesting. Are many of these tombs about trying to create new saints? If someone was a candidate for sainthood, would their tomb be part of a campaign for canonization?
So, in a way, it's difficult to completely answer that, because we are in a period, especially for the early part of where the canonization process is not completely fixed in the way we know it. And if memory serves me well, that's one of the many things we owe to the Council of Lateran for, but I'm not completely sure. I'm not a specialist of the history of canonization. Anyhow, there is a lot of canonization by reputation at in this late 11th century. So in a way, yes, there is this attempt. It's very hard to know whether it's part of a concerted effort to create a saint, because I mean, it's the usual litany of, we don't have that many monuments often apart from the tomb, although of course for Saint Isarn we have a Vita which was written about him, which also is the kind of element you would see in those attempts to elevate a person to another status. I don't think, though, that it's the case, for example, for the tombs of the of children, people like Alfonso Ansúrez or Guillaume de Flandre. But I think it's more about emphasizing the fact that they have a place in heaven, even if there are not actual saints.
Thank you. Yes, and there's a question related to that, which is from Suraya, two panelists. It's fascinating to see male children's tombs. Is there any example of female child's tomb?
Not that I know of for this period, which doesn't mean that there are none, because first of all, there is a lot I don't know. And more importantly, there is a lot we have lost. Obviously, female children would have had tombs too, but whether there had been ornate tombs and I don't know any example out of my head here, and I tried to find some before this conference, but not that I'm aware of, at least not that have survived or are known through documentation.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Now, a question from MSC. Apart from the tomb of Dona Sancha, do you know other Romanesque examples of the elevatio animae with mandorla?
Yes, I think I show. I did show one of them, but so it's pretty evident in Doña Sancha. Actually, in a mandorla, not out of the top of my head. That's a very good point. I would need to check my documentation. I can come back to you about that, but not out of the top of my head.
It strikes me that the iconography of the tomb, is it of Ansures, with the prostrate figure, and then the soul being held behind it, is very similar to, for instance, Byzantine examples of the Dormition of the Virgin. It's a very standard sort of thing.
Yeah, there are actually.
Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. Yes, I do think that the underlying iconography is that of the Dormition of the Virgin, which is much more frequent, be it for the mandorla or for the angels carrying the soul. But yes, and you're absolutely right about the link between this kneeling figure and the soul and the Byzantine iconography.
Yes. Petra T, a question: is it right that for all the tombs, immediate salvation was the most important aspect, and that salvation from purgatory only came in a later period?
Well,
clear question, yeah.
I think that most of, at least the early tombs, up to the early 12th century, they all tend to show either through the epitaph or through the representation itself, the soul already in heaven or going towards heaven. So and clearly, as I said, the idea of the lotus intermedius, so the intermediate place, appears in Cluniac theology in the late 11th century. But once again, it spreads slowly through the theologian circles throughout the 12th century, and it only reaches mainstream. If you look at sermons or masses for the dead, or even tombs, the idea of praying for the soul only from the mid-13th century onwards, the ora pro anima mea is on nearly every tomb. You don't find any such mention on those early tombs, and there is this insistence on salvation, which once again is very much in phase with most of the theology of the time. Although, as I said, the Cluniac theology is changing this at the same time. So the more we move forward, and I'm pretty sure that's the case for the 11th century. I think the more we move forward in the 12th century, the less certain it is, and the more the idea of this intermediate place comes in. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's very interesting. Now from Philip Lancaster. Hello, Philip. How many of the tomb slabs you showed were originally raised off the ground? And if so, by how much? Some still have sarcophagi below, but not all. If the tomb slabs with inscriptions were raised too high, it would not have been possible to read the inscription. So, absolutely.
Actually, if you, some of the slabs I've shown, and for example, those of Isarn and Rodolphe of Swabia, are made to be placed probably on the ground itself. of course, when you start to have a fully sculpted sarcophagi like that of Doña Sancha, it's made to be placed above the ground, not necessarily raised very much, but slightly above the ground. One thing to note is that when we have, and sorry, what I'm going to say is pretty graphic, but when we have full sarcophagi that are that have come to us, like for Doña Sancha, they lack a hole at the bottom of the sarcophagi, which would be used, which would be necessary for the evacuation of the sorry, it's really graphic, but the putrefaction liquids, if the body was to be placed there immediately. So either, of course, we don't know because we have all of this through long and complicated history, but there is the possibility that the sarcophagi would actually never have held the body, but would be just a monument placed somewhere, or that the body would have been placed there after being prepared. Anyhow, these some sarcophagi are made to be seen fully, like that of Doña Sancha. Most of those elements I've shown are made to be seen from above, which gives the idea that even for those leads like Alfonso Ansúrez or Doña Blanca in Najera, or those were actually made to be placed pretty low on the ground. On what type of support, it's hard to know. We have representations of the tombs of the first kings of Jerusalem, and there are slabs which are placed on very short columns. So that's a possibility. But often it's hard to say, but many of those tombs are made to be placed at ground level and to be seen, yes, while circulating around, as I said.
Sure. There are two comments here which relate to the questions which have already been asked. One from Jones, Shirin, Fawzi, the question about a female child's tomb, Reinhildis of Riesenbeck, circa 1170.
Many thanks, Shirin.
And a second added comment from Lucia Rosas. In Portugal, there is another example of elevatio animae. Egas, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Monitz tomb, 12th century. I can send the image by mail.
Yeah, well,
Portuguese tomb, an elevatio animae.
Yes, I admit that the name is familiar. I don't remember it like this, but yes. That's a very good.
Yes, that's good. And there's also a gloss on my comment about the Dormition of the Virgin from Agata Gomolka. What, in your opinion, are the links between these tombs and other contemporary? Sorry, I've lost it. It's flicked off. And other contemporary iconography, where infant-like souls are carried into heaven, e.g. in scenes of a Dormition Assumption of the Virgin, where we just have that comment. Now then here we have another one. In the later, from Catherine Turley, in the later Middle Ages, the soul is often depicted being lifted by angels, but to their judgment. Are the presence of the angels in the Romanesque tombs ever associated with this function?
Well, it's not always possible to say, but you'll have noticed that in quite a few of the examples I've shown, the angels are lifting the soul, yes, but there is a second register where you find other angels, and usually either the Father or the Son, which seems to show a type of representation which once again is more in my I think is more related to the idea of going to heaven, so of a post-judgment salvation than of actually going for the judgment.
Yes, and question from Gerardo. Nájera's Lament for a Queen presents, first of all, the story of an emotion. Is this perspective as emotional as it seems? I mean, is it a singular case?
I think that definitely both the tomb of Alfonso Ansúrez and the tomb of Guillaume of Flanders are also, although they don't have this very theatrical representation you have on the tomb in Nájera, they are also very emotional. On the other hand, if you want to go towards the theatrical and the representation of the death and of the lament around the death, you have the very damaged tomb of Ramon Berenguer, which has all or had all the representations of the funeral, so in a much more emotional aspect. You could also cite, but for later period, the tomb of Henry I of Champagne, which for which of course I have a particular affection, which had quite a lot of texts which related about were about the sadness of the family of Henry after his death.
Yes, thank you. Well, we've come now to the end of our time, I fear. And there is on the screen here a link for you to get that photograph from Portugal, if you could do that, Xavier. But it only remains to me now to thank you most warmly for your very illuminating lecture. It really was extremely stimulating. And I think from a number of questions which came in, it was obviously received very well everywhere. Thank you so much from remote Doha. Amazing to think that you're there. And well, you're missed here. So come back one day.
I will. I plan to be in Scotland by the end of next month.
Good, right. Well, thank you very much, and I hope that I can speak on behalf of us all in thanking you most warmly for this lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a very nice rest of the day. Bye.